In 1492, 3 ships led by Christopher Columbus departed from modern-day Spain out into the unknown expanse of the western Atlantic Ocean, and after many months, finally made landfall on an island within the Bahamas, before eventually moving on from there to Cuba and Hispaniola. To the Spaniards of the time, this was the first known discovery to them of the Americas, and for the Europeans at large, it was the opening chapter for the centuries-long age of discovery that would take European sailors and explorers across the furthest corners of the unknown globe. The thing is, though, this whole period of history was really only the age of discovery for the Europeans, and not for humanity at large. Because by the time Christopher Columbus set sail from Spain in 1492, other humans had already pretty much discovered just about everything there was out there that was of any major importance. The knowledge just hadn't reached the Europeans yet. Millions of humans had already been in the Americas for at least 15,000 years before Columbus even showed up. And of course, Columbus wasn't even the first European to have reached the continent either. Without dispute, it is now known for certain that the Scandinavian Vikings reached and colonized Newfoundland in present-day Canada sometime around 1021, nearly 5 centuries before Columbus's voyage. And further, it's also now widely believed that on the other side of the Americas in the Pacific, the seafaring Polynesians discovered and made contact with indigenous South American people sometime around the year 1200, which, again, was nearly 3 centuries prior to the arrival of Columbus. Nearly everywhere the Europeans went, there were people who were already there, descendants of the ancient first explorers who had initially discovered the land. By the time they discovered Australia, the Aboriginal people who lived there had already been there for nearly 60,000 years, which predates the arrival of modern humans into even Europe. By the time the Europeans discovered New Zealand in 1642, the Maori had already been there for more than 400 years after their discovery in the 13th century. By the time they discovered far-flung and remote Hawaii in 1778, the native Hawaiians had already been there for nearly 800 years after their discovery way back in the 10th century. In truth, the Europeans were very late to the game of global exploration, and mostly everything they found were places that had already been found by someone else before. So, ultimately, that begs the question, what did the Europeans themselves actually discover that nobody else had already discovered hundreds of years previously? And the answer, while probably not as much as you think, is actually still quite a bit, honestly. Hundreds of years before Columbus and the Spaniards came across the Americas, a group of medieval monks living in Ireland sometime in the late 8th century ventured out from their homeland and then, by chance, discovered the previously unknown, uninhabited, and untouched by humanity island of Iceland. There, they set up a small settlement that, for unknown reasons, became abandoned shortly afterwards, which meant that when the Norsemen showed up and discovered Iceland for themselves sometime in the mid-9th century, it was again completely uninhabited and empty. Iceland was the first and arguably the most significant land discovery made by people of European ancestry, occurring generally around the same time period when, over on the other side of the world, the Polynesians were first discovering and settling Hawaii. But there would be many, many more smaller discoveries, and hundreds of years would pass before the next one. In the early 15th century, desperate to find a new maritime trade route to India, the Portuguese began exploring the unknown oceans to their west and south. In so doing, they quickly discovered the uninhabited Azores and Madeira way out in the Atlantic for the very first time, which each remain a part of Portugal to this day. From there, across the next several centuries, the Portuguese made the lion's share of the first geographic discoveries made by humans who were coming from Europe. Around 1456, the Portuguese were the first humans to discover the up to then uninhabited Cape Verde archipelago off the western coast of Africa, and thereafter established the first European colony there in the tropics. Across the next centuries, Portugal forcefully relocated thousands of other human beings as slaves from the African mainland to the islands. while simultaneously migrating in large numbers there themselves, leading to a society that is today incredibly ethnically diverse between European and African ancestry. Then, a few years after that discovery, around 1470, the Portuguese also discovered the uninhabited and undiscovered São Tomé and Príncipe Islands within the Gulf of Guinea off the western coast of Central Africa. And as they did with Cape Verde, the Portuguese gradually colonized the island and transformed it into a major center of the African slave trade. Thousands of African people who were taken as slaves were forcefully relocated there from the African mainland, and across many cycles of social unrest and economic instability across generations, Portugal would ultimately end up ruling both Cape Verde and São Tomé and Príncipe for more than 500 years, until 1975, when the islands they discovered all that time ago were each granted independence. Both sets of islands, however, remain heavily influenced from Portuguese culture, and nearly everyone there continues speaking the Portuguese language. From there, the Portuguese continued making several notable first discoveries of islands that nobody had seen before across the southern Atlantic, including Ascension, St. Helena, and Tristan da Cunha, which is today the home of the most isolated human settlement in the world. The island is more than 2,400 kilometers away from the nearest other inhabited landmass, which is about the same as the distance between New York City and Austin, Texas. Only 245 people live there, and since there isn't any airstrip, the only way to get to and get off the island continues to be by boat. A 6-day, one-way journey to or from South Africa. And then, once the Portuguese got into the Indian Ocean, they discovered several more islands that at the time were uninhabited, like Reunion, Mauritius, Rodrigues, and Seychelles. But they probably weren't the first ones to have actually discovered them. More than likely, the Arabs had already discovered all of these ones centuries previously, but since they never settled any of them, they continued to be uninhabited by the time of the Portuguese discoveries in the 16th century, so they sort of still count. If you include all of those, then the Portuguese were basically the first to discover around 13,800 square kilometers of island territories across the globe, all put together about the same size as Montenegro, that are all collectively home today to a combined population of nearly 3.5 million people. That may not really seem like very much, but that's 20 times more people who live in all the rest of the lands discovered by Europeans combined since the age of exploration began. So, without a doubt, among the Europeans, the Portuguese are the ones who ended up discovering the most important new places for humanity at large. Next up were the Spanish. During Columbus's fourth voyage to the Americas, his crew became the first known to have ever spotted the uninhabited Cayman Islands in the Caribbean just to the west of Cuba. To date, no archaeological evidence has ever been found there to have suggested any prior human habitation before the arrival of Columbus and the Spanish. During the same year in 1503, the Spanish also became the first known humans to have ever discovered the island of Bermuda in the North Atlantic. It remained uninhabited and empty for another century until 1609, when the English began to colonize it. Bermuda remains a possession of the United Kingdom today, and with more than 400 years of continuous control, is the oldest remaining British colony still remaining in the world. Over in the Pacific, the Spanish were also the first to have discovered and settled a string of other interesting islands, most notably the Galapagos. In 1535, they were initially discovered by accident as a Spanish bishop sailed from Panama to Peru and stumbled across them on the way, likely becoming the first group of humans to have ever arrived there. As with the Cayman Islands in the Caribbean, no archaeological evidence has ever so far been found to suggest any human settlements or habitation on the Galapagos prior to the 1535 arrival of the Spanish. So, besides for that achievement, the Spanish also sort of discovered the isolated Pitcairn Islands in the Pacific as well, but only just. The Spanish discovered them abandoned and uninhabited in 1606, but modern archaeological research there has discovered that the Polynesians were truly the first ones to have reached the islands around the 11th century, 600 years before the Spanish. Those Polynesian settlers existed here for centuries until sometime around the mid-1400s when, for unclear reasons, they suddenly went extinct and vanished. For the next 200 years, years, Pitcairn returned to being an abandoned and unknown rock to humanity in the middle of nowhere until the Spanish eventually showed up and rediscovered it again. Other than that, the Spanish were the first to discover a few other islands scattered around the Pacific and Caribbean, but not much else, and the other European countries discovered even less. One of the most notable original discoveries made by the English was the Falkland Islands off the coast of modern-day Argentina during the late 17th century. The Falklands remain a part of the United Kingdom to this day and are home to 2,800 British citizens, despite being located on the other side of the world nearly 8,000 miles away from London. Argentina famously disputed this claim back in the 1980s and invaded the islands, starting a war that killed or wounded more than 3,000 people. Besides the Falklands, the English were also the first to discover some remote and isolated islands within the Antarctic, as well as a few islands nearby to Australia and New Zealand between Christmas Island and Cocos. Interestingly, they were also probably the first to discover Wrangel Island off the coast of Siberia in the Arctic Ocean, most notable for likely being the final place in the world where woolly mammoths once roamed as recently as 4,000 years ago, nearly 600 years after the Great Pyramid of Giza was constructed in Egypt. The Dutch didn't really fare much better. They were really only the first humans to have discovered the far northern islands of Jan Mayen and Svalbard, which they initially called the more Dutch-sounding Spitsbergen, and then the French really only discovered a small set of islands of equal relative unimportance nearer to the Antarctic, like Crozet, Kerguelen, and Bouvet. The only thing to note of any of these islands is their ridiculous level of isolation from the rest of the world. So remote are the Crozet Islands that somebody detonated a nuclear bomb next to them back in 1979, and still to this day, more than 40 years later, nobody knows who did it. And Bouvet Island is, geographically, the most isolated piece of land that exists anywhere on the planet, as it's 1,600 kilometers away from the nearest other landmass, the South Sandwich Islands themselves being pretty remote on their own as well. Given that, it's no wonder that no single human ever showed up here or saw it until 1739, when a sailing Frenchman randomly stumbled upon it. And as improbable as it may seem at first, the Austro-Hungarian Empire of all countries were also likely the very first humans to have ever discovered another remote Arctic archipelago up here in 1873, which they initially claimed for themselves and called Franz Josef Land after their emperor. But the Austro-Hungarian claim never really stuck, and the Soviets annexed the islands later in 1926, but still kept the Austrian name. Besides that, the Russians themselves were also the first to discover a lot of notable places, like, most importantly, the continent of Antarctica, which was likely first spotted by human eyes during a Russian expedition that skirted past the Antarctic coastline more than 200 years ago in 1820. The Russians were also the first to discover a large number of islands within the Arctic Circle to the north of Siberia, including Severnaya Zemlya, which was the final substantial landmass on Earth's surface to have ever been discovered by us. About the same size as Taiwan, this archipelago's existence was only first noted in 1913, just prior to the First World War, and was only charted and mapped for the first time between 1930 and 1932. The Norwegians can claim to be the first humans to have visited a few Arctic islands as well, like this one that they called Ensomheden, or Lonely Island. The only notable thing that's ever happened here was that one time back in 1942 when a German U-boat showed up and blew up a Soviet weather station that had been built on it, and that's about it. So, pretty much, this is the whole map of every place in the world that was actually discovered by humans coming from Europe, largely inspired by this map that was created by Bill Rankin 9 years ago back in 2013. All in all, the Europeans may not have really discovered all that much that wasn't already known about by someone else, but they began their quest of discovery more than 500 years ago, largely in the name of getting better access to spices coming from the East Indies. And thankfully, unlike them, you no longer need to travel to the ends of the earth in order to get access to great tasting food. And now, one of the best places you can start is with HelloFresh. HelloFresh is a meal kit service that ships all the ingredients you need for their recipes in exactly the quantities you need. The packaging is made out of 100% recycled content, and a University of Michigan study found that HelloFresh cut down on food waste by 25% compared with traditional grocery shopping. That makes your meals greener, but on top of that, HelloFresh also makes cooking a lot more convenient. Thanks to those pre-portioned ingredients, your shopping time becomes none and your prep time is greatly reduced. So it means that you can make fresh, home-cooked meals in less time. And every week, you can choose from a rotating selection of dozens of meals that they have on offer. I love the concept so much that I've been using HelloFresh nearly every week for the past year, and I still do to this day. For example, last week I made their chicken sausage spaghetti bolognese with zucchini and parmesan for dinner, which, as always, was delicious. And HelloFresh also makes things easier for you if you're counting calories, since they just tell you the nutritional info for each of your meals. No more adding up all the ingredients or guessing. Altogether, I love HelloFresh since it reduces my dependence on unhealthy and expensive freezer and delivery food and helps me free up more of my time. So I'd encourage you to try them out as well. Just click the button that's here on screen right now or go to HelloFresh.com and use the code RealLifeLore16 for up to 16 free meals and 3 surprise gifts. And, as always, thank you so much for watching.